Welcome to our deep dive. You know all those self-help books about finding happiness?
Oh yeah, tons of them.
Well, this time, we're flipping the script.
Really? How so?
We're diving into a book called Instructions for Unhappiness.
Instructions for Unhappiness. By who?
Paul Watzlawick. It's all about how we sabotage our own happiness.
That's a pretty unique take. I like it.
Yeah.
So what's the big takeaway?
It's funny, right off the bat, Watzlawick talks about this paradox of happiness.
A paradox. What does he mean?
He says that constantly chasing happiness can actually backfire.
That's interesting. I can kind of see that. Like the more you focus on being happy, the more elusive it becomes.
Exactly. He even quotes Dostoevsky.
Oh wow, bringing in the heavy hitters. What did Dostoevsky have to say about it?
Well, he had this kind of cynical view of human nature. He said something like, even if you gave someone everything they ever wanted, they'd still find a way to screw it up.
Classic Dostoevsky. Always looking at the darker side of things.
Right. But it makes you think, right? Even when things are good, there's that little voice in the back of our minds whispering doubts.
It's like we can't just let ourselves be content. Always looking for the next thing to worry about.
And to prove his point, Watzlawick mentions this radio debate where a bunch of experts couldn't even agree on what happiness means.
So it's this slippery concept then, hard to pin down.
Totally. And that's a big part of his point. He says the way we cling to our beliefs, to how things should be, that's a big source of unhappiness.
Oh, I see. So like having this rigid idea of what happiness should look like can actually prevent you from experiencing it.
Exactly. And get this, he even uses Hamlet as an example.
Hamlet, the Shakespearean tragedy.
The one and only. He argues that Hamlet's stubbornness, his refusal to let go of his beliefs even when they were destroying him, that's what led to his downfall.
That's a pretty powerful example. It makes you think about how our own rigid beliefs might be holding us back.
Watzlawick calls it becoming your own adversary, you know?
So like we're fighting against ourselves, creating conflict where there doesn't need to be any.
Exactly. We're constantly battling between how we think things should be and how they actually are. Have you ever experienced that? Like digging your heels in on a viewpoint, even when it's causing problems in your relationships.
Oh, absolutely. I think we all have those moments where we just can't let go of being right.
And that's just the beginning. Watzlawick goes on to explore all these ways we use our past experiences to fuel our current unhappiness.
The past. But that's already happened. How can we change that?
We might not be able to change the past, but we can definitely change how we think about it.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we do that? How do we stop the past from messing with our present happiness?
Well, Watzlawick outlines 4 almost like games we play with ourselves.
Games. Tell me more. I like games. Hopefully these are more fun than the ones I usually play.
Well, the first one's called romanticizing the past. We create this ideal version of the past, like a golden age where everything was perfect.
Ah, the good old days. When things were simpler, right. But we all know that's not completely true.
Right. We filter out the bad memories and just focus on the good, which makes us long for a time that never really existed.
I see. So we're setting ourselves up for disappointment by comparing the present to this idealized version of the past. What's the next game?
The next one's a little darker. He calls it the Lot's wife syndrome.
Lot's wife.
Yeah.
Like the story from the Bible.
Exactly. Remember, she looks back at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah even though she was told not to, and turns into a pillar of salt.
Oh yeah, I remember that story.
Yeah.
But what does that have to do with happiness?
It's a metaphor. Watzlawick uses it to show how dwelling on the past, that inability to let go, can prevent us from living fully in the present.
That's deep. So by constantly looking back, we're missing out on what's happening right now.
Exactly. And missing out on potential happiness in the process.
Okay, got it. 2 games down, 2 to go. What's next?
The third one is the fatal glass of beer excuse.
The fatal glass of beer. That sounds ominous.
It's all about using past mistakes to justify continuing bad behavior.
Oh, I see. It's like saying, well, I already messed up once, might as well keep messing up.
Right. It's a way to avoid responsibility for our actions and just keep repeating those same self-destructive patterns.
It's like we're trapped in a cycle of negativity.
Ooh.
Okay, I'm definitely guilty of playing that game sometimes. What about the last one?
The last one is the lost key syndrome.
The lost key. Lost keys are definitely frustrating.
Yeah.
How does that relate to happiness?
It's about clinging to solutions that worked in the past, even when they're not effective anymore.
So it's like if it worked once, it should always work, right?
Right. It's the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality taken to the extreme. And to make this point, Watzlawick tells this funny story about a Venetian dock worker.
A Venetian dock worker. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So after the Austrians left Venice, this dock worker starts complaining about how they got him used to eating 3 meals a day.
Wait, he's complaining about eating 3 meals a day.
It's ironic, right? It just shows that even positive changes can be twisted into sources of unhappiness.
Wow. It's like we become so attached to our routines, even if they're not serving us anymore, that we resist change even when it's for the better.
Exactly. It's the more of the same trap.
So to sum it up, dwelling on the past, whether by romanticizing it, using it as an excuse, or clinging to old solutions, just fuels our unhappiness.
Exactly. And now Watzlawick takes us on a journey into the world of the unconscious mind.
Ooh, getting deep now. Our unconscious mind.
He explores how those hidden thoughts and beliefs we're not even aware of can create problems in our lives.
That's a bit spooky. I mean, if we're not even aware of these thoughts, how can we control them?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? But first, we have to become aware of them.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does Watzlawick explain this whole unconscious mind thing?
He uses this really funny observation by Margaret Mead.
Margaret Mead, the anthropologist.
The one and only. She said that Americans will pretend to have headaches to avoid social obligations, while Russians will actually develop them.
Oh, that's funny. But what's the point?
It illustrates how powerful our unconscious minds are. They can actually manifest physical symptoms based on our thoughts and beliefs.
So we're not just making it up in our heads, it's real.
It can be. Watzlawick even gives examples of people who seem to attract misfortune without realizing they're playing a part in it.
So they're unconsciously sabotaging themselves.
It seems that way. It makes you wonder how often we do the same thing without even realizing it.
That's a scary thought. It's like we're our own worst enemy sometimes.
And it gets even more interesting. He then tells the story about a man who convinces himself his neighbor won't lend him a hammer.
A hammer? What's so special about a hammer?
It's not about the hammer itself. It's about the assumptions we make. This man gets so worked up about it that he creates this whole conflict in his head, all because of his own assumptions.
So he's like manufacturing drama.
Exactly. And that's what we often do, right? We jump to conclusions, attribute negative intentions to others, and create problems where none exist.
It's like we're looking for evidence to confirm our negative beliefs, even if there's no real basis for them.
And that just leads to more unhappiness.
It's amazing how good we are at finding ways to be unhappy. But Watzlawick doesn't stop there. Oh, no. He goes on to talk about relationships.
Relationships, I mean, those should make us happy, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Watzlawick dives into how we can turn even the most loving relationships into a source of unhappiness.
Oh no, I'm already feeling a little uneasy. Give me the bad news. What does he say?
Well, he brings up this concept called the be spontaneous paradox.
The be spontaneous paradox. That sounds a bit like a riddle.
It does, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually a really insightful look at how we interact with each other. Watzlawick says demanding spontaneity from someone, expecting them to be happy and carefree on command, it just creates this impossible situation. It's like, can you genuinely laugh if someone forces you to?
That's a great analogy. It just doesn't work, does it?
It doesn't. The very act of demanding spontaneity kind of kills the whole point. And he uses this, kind of chilling example from a novel called The Collector.
The Collector. I don't think I've read that one.
It's about this guy who's obsessed with a young woman and, he kidnaps her. He thinks if he could just control her environment, she'll eventually fall in love with him.
Oh, wow. That took a dark turn. But it does illustrate the paradox, I guess.
It really does. But it's not just about these, dramatic situations. Watzlawick says this dynamic shows up in everyday life all the time.
Like how? Give me an example.
Think about parents who demand their kids enjoy doing their homework. Or maybe a partner pressuring their significant other to be more affectionate.
Oh, yeah. That pressure to feel or express something you don't really feel, it's suffocating.
It is. And it leads to so much inner conflict and, you guessed it, unhappiness. Have you ever felt that kind of pressure in your own relationships?
Oh, absolutely. I think most of us have at some point. So, moving on from those tricky relationship dynamics, Watzlawick then explores how our own self-esteem impacts the love we receive.
Self-esteem. So, how we view ourselves affects how others love us.
That's what he's suggesting. And he uses some interesting sources to make his point. Dostoevsky again, of course. But also, and this might surprise you, Groucho Marx.
Groucho Marx, the comedian, really.
You wouldn't expect it, would you? But think about his famous line, "I wouldn't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member."
Oh, yeah, I get it. It's like he's putting himself down, saying he's not worthy.
Exactly. And Watzlawick argues that this type of thinking, this low self-esteem, makes us believe that anyone who loves us must be flawed somehow.
Wow, that's a tough one. So we're basically saying, if you love me, there must be something wrong with you.
It's like we can't believe we're worthy of love, so we project that onto the people who care about us. And he brings in Artie Lane to support this idea. You know, the psychiatrist who wrote a lot about self-acceptance.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Interesting connection.
He even included a poem in one of his books that perfectly illustrates this self-defeating mindset.
So basically, we're rejecting love because we don't think we deserve it.
It can definitely create a barrier to experiencing love fully.
Makes you realize how important self-love is for healthy relationships. It's something to think about for sure.
And while we're on the topic of relationships, Watzlawick challenges another seemingly positive thing: selfless help.
Selfless help. You mean like helping others without expecting anything in return? What's wrong with that?
Well, he suggests that even acts of kindness can have hidden motives.
Hidden motives. You mean like some people help others just to make themselves feel good?
It's not always that conscious, but sometimes, yeah, there can be ulterior motives at play. And he's not saying that all help is self-serving, but we should at least be aware of the potential pitfalls.
So like sometimes help can actually be more about the helper than the person being helped.
It's a possibility. Think about it. You know that saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime.
Yeah, classic advice. What about it?
But what if the person teaching to fish gets some sense of power or satisfaction from that dynamic? Like they need the other person to remain dependent on them.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're not really helping the person become self-sufficient. They're kind of keeping them stuck.
Exactly. It creates this codependent relationship where the helper needs the helpee to stay in need. And he uses the example of the savior trying to fix someone to show how this can backfire.
So the takeaway is that true help should empower others to help themselves.
Exactly. And that brings us to the importance of communication, especially when dealing with different cultures.
Cross-cultural communication, that can definitely be a challenge.
It can. Watzlawick gives some specific examples of behaviors that are totally normal in one culture but might be seen as strange or even offensive in another.
Like a
Well, even something as simple as eye contact. In some cultures, it's a sign of respect, while in others, it's considered rude.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I've definitely experienced that traveling.
It just shows how important it is to be aware of those cultural differences so we can avoid misunderstandings.
It's all about being sensitive and respectful of other cultures, even if they're different from our own.
And finally, Watzlawick brings in this interesting concept from game theory: zero-sum games versus non-zero-sum games.
Game theory. That sounds complicated.
It's not that bad. Zero-sum means if one person wins, the other loses. But non-zero-sum means everyone can benefit.
Oh, so it's about cooperation versus competition.
Exactly. And Watzlawick argues that seeing life as a zero-sum game, well, that just leads to conflict and unhappiness. But a non-zero-sum perspective, that opens up the possibility of shared success.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. And that's a much happier way to live, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But the question is, how do we shift our thinking from that win-lose mentality to one that's more collaborative and mutually beneficial?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And luckily, Watzlawick has some answers for us.
So after hearing about all these ways we make ourselves unhappy, you're probably thinking, is there any hope?
A very good question. And thankfully, Watzlawick doesn't leave us hanging. He actually ends the book on a pretty hopeful note.
Oh, good. I was getting a little worried there for a minute.
He reminds us that even though we might be experts at creating our own unhappiness, we also have the power to choose something different, to change the game we're playing.
So what does this new game look like? What are the rules?
Well, Watzlawick is it's all about three things: fairness, trust, and tolerance.
Fairness, trust, and tolerance. Those are pretty big concepts. What do they look like in practice?
It's about shifting away from that win-lose mentality we talked about earlier.
You mean that zero-sum game where it's all about competition?
Exactly. Instead, we start looking for win-win situations. We realize that someone else's success doesn't take away from our own.
It's more like we all rise together. Like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Perfect analogy. It's about creating abundance instead of scarcity. And it all starts with those three values: fairness, trust, and tolerance.
So treating everyone with respect and compassion, believing in the good in people, and accepting that there are many different ways of seeing the world.
You got it. It's a Pretty big shift in perspective.
It is. It's like we're taking off these judgmental glasses we've been wearing and finally seeing things clearly.
Hmm.
Makes you wonder how different our lives would be if we all adopted this approach.
I know, right? And speaking of different perspectives, Watzlawick leaves us with one last quote from Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky again.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
He says, happiness is often just a matter of recognizing what we already have.
Wow. That's so simple, yet so profound. We're so busy chasing after happiness, we forget to appreciate what's right in front of us. It's like we're looking for the keys to happiness and they've been in our pocket the whole time.
That's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up this deep dive into instructions for unhappiness,
Yeah.
what's the final takeaway? What do we do with all this?
Well, what if instead of being experts at creating unhappiness, we became masters at cultivating our own well-being?
Instead of focusing on what's wrong, we start appreciating what's right.
Exactly. It's a powerful shift in mindset.
It really is. So what have we learned from exploring this world of unhappiness? It seems a bit counterintuitive, but diving into the ways we sabotage our own happiness can actually be a path to finding more joy.
It's all about awareness. Once we understand how we get in our own way, we can start making different choices.
And those choices can lead us to a more fulfilling and joyful life.
It's been an incredible journey exploring these ideas with you.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground, from the paradox of happiness, to the games we play with ourselves, to the importance of fairness, trust, and tolerance. It's been quite a ride. But ultimately, this deep dive has shown us that we have more control over our happiness than we might think.
And that's a very empowering message. So to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of instructions for unhappiness.
And that you've gained some valuable insights into the often surprising ways we create our own reality.
Remember, the journey to a happier life begins with understanding ourselves and with making conscious choices that align with our values.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep choosing joy.